Vanessa Mitchell, who went out to buy a house, and this house you bought, and it had a history. What was the history?
It was used as the old prison in the old days for the witches.
In the quiet coastal village of St Osyth in Essex, a place already steeped in bloody legends of headless saints and fire-breathing dragons, stands an unassuming cottage known as the Cage. To a passer-by, the Cage looks like any other weathered village home, tucked beside a pub on Colchester Road. Locals whisper that this little house was once a prison for witches, a site of misery dating back to the 16th century witch trials. By the end of the 20th century, the Cage had gained infamy as England's most haunted house, a cause célèbre for ghost hunters, and, of course, a source of spine-tingling tales on television and in tabloids. To understand the Cage's dark allure, we must begin in the year 1582. Elizabethan England was in the grip of witch hysteria, and in the village of St Osyth, 14 women were accused of witchcraft and hauled before the courts in Chelmsford. The first accused, and now the most famous, was Ursula Kemp, a local midwife and cunning woman, apparently. Ursula's troubles began with neighbourly disputes that took a fatal turn. After a falling out with a client, Grace Thurlow, whose infant died tragically, fingers pointed to Ursula's supposed maleficium. Under pressure from authorities, notably the zealous witch-hunting Justice Brian Darcy, Ursula confessed to witchcraft. She even claimed to keep 4 supernatural familiars, 2 cats, a toad and a lamb, and named other village women as fellow witches too. It was a self-incriminating confession extracted with false promises of mercy. Darcy showed none, condemning Ursula to death, and in the end Ursula Kemp and one other woman, Elizabeth Bennet, were hanged at Chelmsford in 1582, becoming 2 of the so-called witches of St Osyth. According to local law, before their execution, Ursula and the other accused languished in a small village jail known as the Cage. In those days, a cage was essentially a lockup, a one-room jail for holding petty criminals or suspects overnight until they could be brought to trial. St Osyth's lockup earned an eternal place in ghostly lore because it purportedly held the doomed witches during their interrogations. A plaque mounted on the cottage wall in modern times proudly, or perhaps ominously, proclaimed, "The Cage, medieval prison. St Osyth resident Ursula Kemp was imprisoned here before being hanged as a witch in 1582. It was last used as a prison in 1908. This sign, visible to every visitor, cemented the building's identity as the Witches' Prison. It's an evocative piece of folklore, and it sets the stage for the Cage's later reputation as a nexus of paranormal unrest. However, historians do note a critical caveat. The actual records of Ursula Kemp's imprisonment are scant. St Osyth Museum researchers report that while Ursula certainly was interrogated at St Clair's Hall, the manor house of Justice Darcy, there was no evidence that she was ever held in the Cage itself. Even so, the tale's been reported so often that the Cage's identity as a witch prison is almost taken for granted in popular modern accounts. Folklore has, in a sense, overwritten the ambiguity in the historical record, and as we'll later discover, this blending of fact and folklore has significant implications for interpreting the hauntings.
I thought it would be haunted, but I had quite an idea because all the local villagers said that it was. I thought there was a chance, but I didn't think it was as bad as it was.
St Osyth's haunted reputation doesn't rest on the Cage alone. The entire village has a rich supernatural backstory. It takes its name from a medieval princess turned saint, Osyth, who, according to legend, was beheaded by Danish raiders but miraculously picked up her severed head and walked to the local nunnery before collapsing. For centuries, villagers have claimed that on the anniversary of her death, St Osyth's headless ghost strolls through the churchyard at midnight. The village annals even include the tale of a fire-breathing dragon that sets buildings ablaze in 1179, and in the 17th century, the famous witch-finder General Matthew Hopkins prowled this region and sent more accused witches to the gallows. Simply put, St Osyth has always been a fertile ground for ghost stories. The soil here has been watered with legend and blood, a cursed little village, as one writer put it. Every page of its wretched history soused in the supernatural. The legacy of the 1582 witch trial in particular left an indelible mark. The frightened and fascinated have long wondered if the spirits of the wrongfully condemned still linger, unable to rest. Intriguingly, a sensational discovery in the 20th century rekindled interest in St Osyth's witches and lent credence to the idea that their souls might be unsettled. In 1921, a local man digging in his garden unearthed 2 human skeletons with iron nails driven through their joints. This grisly detail, nails in the knees and elbows, was a folk practice meant to ensure that witches couldn't rise from the grave. The remains were found not far from the cage, and immediately sparked speculation that they belonged to Ursula Kemp and one of her fellow accused. The enterprising homeowner, Charles Brooker, even put the bones on display for tourists, charging an admission fee to view the witches' skeletons, until a mysterious fire burned his cottage down. Locals whispered about the curse of the witches striking Brooker, though his grandson later admitted the old man likely knocked over a kerosene lamp whilst inebriated. In time, one skeleton, believed to be Ursula's, was sold to the Museum of Witchcraft in Cornwall for £99, and then passed to an eccentric collector who kept it for decades. Finally, in 2011, these remains were re-examined by experts and ceremoniously reburied in St Osyth's cemetery. The bones were determined not to belong to Ursula after all, but to a young male, a case of mistaken identity in the grave. Nevertheless, for 90 years, locals and visitors fully believed they had the physical bones of a murdered witch on display, and that macabre belief only amplified the cage's mistake. The idea that Ursula's disturbed remains, or her restless spirit, might be calling out from beneath the soil, and it became part of village lore.
Keep coming towards me, please. Are you female? Make that flash really fast if you're female. Can you stop? Stop. Oh!
I kind of think, after years of owning it, I don't want to sound corny, but the cage wants to talk. I think if they didn't want to be known in there, they wouldn't be so active.
By the late 20th century, the cage had stood for hundreds of years, albeit with some modifications over time, and it was known around town as a quirky historical oddity. It had no real official significance. Paranormal researcher John Fraser notes, tellingly, it isn't even a listed heritage building, despite its alleged age. And until the 2000s, the cage was just a privately owned cottage that happened to have a spooky plaque on the wall. But all that would change very soon. A new chapter was about to be written in the story, one that would catapult the cage from obscure curiosity to headline-making haunted house. And it began in 2004 with the arrival of a new owner who thought she was buying her dream home, only to find herself living in a nightmare.
So how bad was it?
Well, on a typical day, you'd be sitting there, things would fly across the room, door latches would go up and down the stairs. About 3 years I had to stay in there. Well, because you can't, when you buy somewhere, you can't kind of say, oh, I'll move tomorrow. You know, I had a mortgage on it.
But there's a ghost in it.
There was more than one, I think. One day I was doing the ironing downstairs. Or anyway, I went upstairs with the ironing, and I saw a man standing at the top of the stairs, right next to Jessie's cot. Yeah, and he had modern day clothes on. He wasn't. When I'd seen Jack in there, he had
wasn't
old
a burglar
fashioned
or something.
No, Eamon, he was definitely he wasn't there.
Vanessa Mitchell, a successful 32-year-old financial saleswoman, purchased the cage and moved in with high hopes. The charming 2-bedroom cottage with its Tudor beams and medieval lore had instantly captivated her. Vanessa later recalled, "It was calling me. It needed me. It wanted me. I just had to be the owner." And the folklore about imprisoned witches and ghostly goings-on didn't deter her at all. In fact, she barely gave it a thought, beyond finding the history interesting. But as she crossed the threshold with her belongings, Vanessa had a jolt of foreboding. I knew from day one it wasn't normal, And it wasn't right, she admits. It was as if the house had been lying in wait for a new victim, and in Vanessa, it found one. Vanessa wasn't alone at first. She invited her childhood friend Nicole Kirtley to live with her as a housemate. Nicole would soon become a witness to many inexplicable events in the cage. The very atmosphere inside felt heavy and oppressive from the beginning. Nicole described it like walking in jelly, a dense, uneasy feeling that hung in the air for no obvious reason. Initially, the two women tried to brush off their unease and settle in, but it didn't take long before strange phenomena erupted around them, shattering any semblance of normalcy. The cage seemed to come alive with noises and movement that just defied explanation. One of the first signs that something was amiss came in the form of unexplained sounds. Loud banging would reverberate from downstairs when nobody else was in the house. On several occasions, Vanessa and Nicole would be startled by what sounded like smashing glass or crockery in the kitchen. Yet upon investigation, nothing was broken. Objects didn't stay put where the women left them. They would set down their keys or a television remote, only to find them later in a completely different room. Sometimes items went missing altogether and then reappeared in odd places. The activity escalated into outright physical disturbances too. Doors would slam shut on their own with tremendous force, latches rattling as if an unseen hand was violently shaking them. Taps would turn on by themselves. At night, they could hear the creaking of footsteps on the wooden staircase when nobody was there. It was as though an invisible intruder prowled the cottage at will. Multiple witnesses would later corroborate these classic poltergeist happenings. In fact, paranormal teams who investigated the cage catalogued these same patterns occurring over and over. The footsteps, the door latches suddenly jolting open, household objects hurtling across a room. And Vanessa's cousin, for example, was once hit in the head by a flying can of Coke and sugar packets that launched off the kitchen counter. She'd been alone in the house at the time, and the incident left her badly shaken. These recurring disturbances gave the cage a mischievous, almost aggressive personality. It wasn't just one isolated creak or thump, it was sustained activity. It got to a point where we were expecting something to happen every day, Vanessa said. Living there was like living on the edge, constantly. If the cage's invisible prankster was trying to scare the new occupants, it succeeded, and then some. One bright spring afternoon, not in the dead of night, notably, Vanessa was walking through the hall when she saw, with her own eyes, a tall, dark figure materialize near the doorway. It appeared human-like and solid for a moment, a towering male silhouette, and then suddenly it dissolved into thick black smoke that oozed its way into the living room before vanishing. Vanessa stood there in shock. This had been a clear, daylight manifestation. This wasn't at night, and I believed it wanted me to see it, like I had moved into its house, she recounted. It was as if the entity was making itself known, staking a claim on the place. That was the first of 3 apparitions that Vanessa would personally see during her time in the cage. On another occasion, she encountered a ghostly woman in antiquated clothing gliding through the house, carrying a wooden bowl filled with herbs. This eerie figure, observed fleetingly by Vanessa, immediately evoked the image of a 16th century healer or midwife, perhaps one of the accused witches, brewing a remedial potion. It's one of the few phenomena that seems directly connected to the witch trial history. A third apparition took the form of a grotesque, hateful face that appeared pressed against the glass of the back door as Vanessa fled the house one day. She'd been spooked by loud crashing and was running out with her baby in her arms, more on that soon, when she slammed the door behind her, only to see a twisted, ghostly face leering at her from the other side of the glass, which then disappeared. That image, she said, is forever burned into her memory. Others too reported seeing strange figures. A friend of Vanessa's swore she saw a pale female figure peering out of an upstairs window of the cage at the exact same moment that 3 other visitors heard a tremendous crash from the same room. And despite these sightings, no single ghostly figure became a regular. Unlike some hauntings that have a signature ghost, a grey lady or a headless monk or something, the cage's apparitions were infrequent, but they were varied. And this made it all the more confusing. What or who was haunting the cage? A witch? A warden? Something far older and more sinister? And in the absence of a clear answer, of course fear fills the void. As weeks turned into months, Vanessa and Nicole realised with dread that the unseen forces in the cage were not content with mere pranks or peekaboo appearances. They could also hurt the living. Both women experienced the feeling of being touched or grabbed by invisible hands. Hair pulling was one common occurrence. More than once, Vanessa would be walking by the old prison cell area, only to feel a sharp yank on her ponytail, as if someone yanked it from behind in anger. One day, Nicole screamed as she felt something crawl across the floor, the disembodied, gnarled hands of an unseen entity scrabbling towards her before vanishing. This horrifying vision of severed hands reaching out recalls classic ghost lore, and it utterly terrified the roommates. The violence escalated dramatically in one incident involving a friend named Michael O'Connell. Mikey, as he was known, was standing on a chair helping to fix an overhead light fixture for Vanessa, when suddenly an unseen force shoved him hard. He was grabbed by the shoulders and pulled backwards off the chair, and then dragged down the staircase by no visible assailant. He tumbled and he hit the floor, fortunately not breaking any bones, but he left bruised and badly frightened. This was no minor poltergeist mischief. This was a direct attack. And to Vanessa, this was proof that whatever haunted the cage meant harm to the living.
The feeling of being in such a state, the power or the negative that house has on your mental state of health, and it happened to me.
Vanessa herself was not spared. In 2007, she became pregnant with her first child, and during her pregnancy, there were multiple incidents where the entities seemed to lash out at her physically. She was pushed to the ground, an attack that could easily have caused a miscarriage. Thankfully, it didn't. On another occasion, she felt a sudden smack on her backside. As incredible as it sounds, Vanessa described it as being spanked on the bottom by an invisible presence. Paranormal investigators would later document at least 5 cases of people receiving unexplained scratches, bruises, or burn marks on their skin whilst at the cage. In 3 of those cases, photographs exist of the strange wound patterns, typically 3 long, claw-like scratches appearing on backs or arms where the person swears no one physically touched them. This kind of phenomenon is often attributed to poltergeists or demonic forces in ghost lore, and it certainly added to the cage's fearsome reputation. Visitors might leave not just scared, but literally scared. As if poltergeist activity and ghostly apparitions were not enough, the cage also produced a handful of really bizarre phenomena that seemed pulled from a horror film. One day, for example, Nicole noticed something odd on the floor near a rug. It looked like the rug itself was moving. The women lifted the carpet and recoiled in revulsion because beneath was a writhing mass of white maggots covering the floorboards. The sight was like something from The Exorcist. There was no rotten meat, no food, no logical reason for maggots to suddenly appear in the middle of a clean living room, but there they were. On another occasion, visitors pointed out to Vanessa that tiny blood splatters had mysteriously appeared on her tiled wall and floor. She began to find sticky pools of dark blood in the corners of the house. Viscous, reddish puddles that would seep up from nowhere. Each time there was absolutely no source for the blood. No injured person, no dead animal, nothing dripping from the ceiling. It was as though the house itself was bleeding. These gruesome manifestations of blood were perhaps the most disturbing of all the phenomena, confronting the witnesses with tangible evidence that something was dreadfully wrong. Even hardened skeptics would struggle to explain how multiple people could observe unexplained blood pooling on the floor. By late 2007, Vanessa's friend and stalwart housemate Nicole had reached her breaking point. The constant fear, sleepless nights, and nerve-jangling incidents were just too much, and Nicole moved out, apologetically telling Vanessa she just couldn't take it anymore.
And it was when that she left, and then I started getting quiet. You know, it's like, oh no, I'm on my own. And you kind of don't mind if there's someone there. Nicole, did you see that?
Vanessa was now left entirely alone in the house, pregnant, and later with the newborn baby, her son Jesse. This should have been one of the happiest times of her life, but instead it was the darkest. Virtually all her other friends began avoiding visiting the cage. They would make excuses not to come around because stepping inside the house, well, it gave them the creeps. Vanessa found herself isolated, a single mother trapped in what she believed to be a haunted prison of malevolent entities. The irony was not lost on her. In the 1580s, the cage may have held captive accused witches, and now in the 2000s, it felt like she was the prisoner. Vanessa's life in the cage after her baby's arrival became a waking nightmare. She was so terrified of the aggressive presence that she stopped using the bathroom at night, resorting to a chamber pot under her bed rather than walking down the dark hall to the loo. She never dared turn the lights off. Every lamp, the television, everything stayed illuminated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just to ward off the oppressive darkness. Sleep came only in brief, fitful snatches. Imagine the psychological toll this would take on you, the constant adrenaline, the hypervigilance, the maternal anxiety for her infant's safety, and indeed it seemed that baby Jesse became a focal point of the entity's malice. Vanessa observed that Jesse often screamed uncontrollably for no discernible reason, his eye tracking something unseen around the room. More than normal infant fussiness, these episodes made the hairs on Vanessa's neck stand up on edge. I thought he could see something in the room that I couldn't, she said. I could feel something. It was evil. It was malevolent. It was bad. On one occasion, she left the baby sleeping in his Moses basket in the living room and stepped out back only for 5 minutes. And when she returned, the basket with Jesse in it was gone. Panicking, she searched and discovered the entire basket had been moved outside the back door, as if something had carried the baby out of the house in her very brief absence. No one else was there. It was inexplicable and deeply frightening. Who or what could have done it? The implications were terrifying. Her baby could have been taken or harmed. The final straw came a few weeks later. Vanessa laid Jesse down for a nap in his crib upstairs and went to the kitchen to iron some clothes, baby monitor on. Suddenly, she heard Jesse let out a blood-curdling scream from upstairs, and at the same moment, a few of his toy blocks that had been on the floor started sliding across the kitchen tiles towards her, on their own. Vanessa's heart leapt into her throat. She dropped the iron and ran towards the staircase, and as she looked up the stairwell, she saw a horrifying sight, a misty figure or shadow right at the top of the stairs, which then moved into the bedroom and slammed the door in her face, locking it from inside. In a frenzy, she fought the door open and rushed to find the crib empty. Her son wasn't in his cot anymore, and in a split second she spied Jesse on the adult bed. Someone or something had taken him out of the cot and laid him on the bed. The baby was wailing in terror, and Vanessa snatched up her child and bolted down the stairs, out of the back door, and without even closing it, ran. Outside, as she gasped for breath, Jesse abruptly stopped crying. It was as if crossing the threshold out of the cage broke whatever spell had upset him.
That was one of the last things, to be honest.
Because he was near your baby?
Yeah, and he had modern-day clothes on. He wasn't, when I'd seen Jack in there, he had
wasn't a
old-fashioned.
burglar or something.
No, Eamon, he was definitely, he wasn't there.
At that moment, she knew she couldn't spend another night under that roof. And in mid-2008, after 4 years of relentless torment, Vanessa Mitchell fled the cage for good. She gathered a few essentials, took baby Jesse, and went to stay elsewhere, never to return as a resident. I feel lucky to have escaped, she would later write. The haunted cage had broken her, But she survived, and she got out while she still could. Vanessa's dramatic exit from the cage did not mark the end of its story. In many ways, it was actually the beginning of a new chapter, because by abandoning the house but retaining ownership, Vanessa inadvertently turned the cage into a sort of paranormal time capsule, perfectly preserved for investigation. She was done living there herself, but she wasn't opposed to letting others visit the property, whether as tenants or ghost hunters, to see what they experienced. And in the years following 2008, the cage became one of the most scrutinised haunted houses in Britain, drawing both curious amateurs and seasoned paranormal researchers from around the world. As news spread that England's most haunted house was effectively standing empty, people wanted to test their courage and their scepticism within its walls. Immediately after Vanessa moved out, she attempted to simply rent the cage as a normal residence, perhaps hoping that a tenant might not experience the same horrors. 2 separate sets of tenants moved in during 2008 to 2009. Neither stayed longer than a few months. At least one tenant directly reported to Vanessa that numerous inexplicable incidents had occurred, matching the kinds of things she herself had witnessed. Doors opening on their own, strange noises, that oppressive feeling. The tenants corroborated that the cage's phenomena were not a figment of Vanessa's imagination. Unfortunately, Vanessa was unable to secure formal interviews with those renters, and they didn't go public with any details. They simply left. The implication was clear, however. Even hardy renters found the cage unlivable. In the early 2010s, Vanessa opened the cage to booked paranormal investigations and overnight ghost vigils. It became a sought-after location for ghost hunting groups, medium-led spiritual circles, and even television crews from various paranormal reality shows. The cottage's sinister story, witches, poltergeists, the single mother who fled, made it a media darling, and the British television series Most Haunted mentioned it, and a team from Help My House is Haunted filmed an episode on site in 2018, emerging visibly shaken by what they termed a confrontation with real malevolence.
For years, this picture postcard house was taken over by a host of spirits, both positive and negative.
The morning after the investigation, we all felt we'd helped Vanessa move on.
We all felt it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt real fear.
But beyond the entertainment world, a few diligent researchers took a deeper interest in scientifically documenting the cage's hauntings. According to John Fraser, certain phenomena kept recurring with striking consistency, effectively establishing a core haunting profile for the cage. The footsteps and the sounds. Many witnesses reported hearing heavy footsteps on the staircase when there was nobody there. These phantom steps often occurred in the quiet of night and sometimes in broad daylight. The door latches opening. So the bedroom doors, which had old-fashioned latches, would suddenly jolt open on their own, even when securely latched shut. In some cases, the violent swinging open of a door was accompanied by an icy cold gust, a classic cold spot phenomenon, though the cage isn't particularly drafty. Physical scratches and marks. As noted, at least 5 people have reported being scratched or poked, or even bitten, by something unseen on the premises. Claw-like scratches appeared on one investigator's back while he was in the cage room. He felt a burning sensation, and a teammate lifted his shirt to find fresh scratch marks. Another individual had 3 long scratches manifest on their forearm after feeling it prickling with pain. Emotional influences and possession. Perhaps the most intriguing and alarming pattern was the number of people who experienced sudden, intense emotional or psychological changes while inside the property. Fraser documented a cluster of cases where individuals felt an overwhelming and uncharacteristic surge of fear or anger or despair washing over them, sometimes so extreme that it bordered on a possession-like trance. One seasoned investigator recounted how he abruptly became disoriented and overcome by rage towards a colleague for absolutely no reason. I suddenly felt a strong hatred towards that team member, he said, describing how he then staggered as if drunk, unable to control his legs. He was dragged outside into the courtyard, at which point this man broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. And while apparitions were less frequent than the poltergeist activity, investigators did log sightings of fleeting shadow figures. Several team members on different nights reported the figure of a tall, dark man lurking near the cage room or on the landing, matching Vanessa's moving day sightings. A few others claimed to see the woman with a bowl that Vanessa described, or at least a woman in old-fashioned garb, usually upstairs. And there was EVP and some intelligent responses, so many visiting groups tried to communicate with the spirits of the cage using EVP recordings, spirit boxes, Ouija boards, and other methods. The results were mixed. There were some tantalizing EVP clips where faint voices seemed to respond to questions. "Get out," and "help me," and even one recording that some interpreted as a child's voice saying "mummy," but EVPs are notoriously subjective. A few sessions with a spirit box produced a male voice that gave the name Steve repeatedly when asked who was present, though no known historical figure of that name connects to the site. One medium claimed to converse with an entity calling itself Judith, supposedly a witch who died there, but another medium the next week felt the presence of a male jailer. This inconsistency of intelligent responses led Fraser to exclude psychic medium testimony from his report entirely. In 2017, Richard Estep, a British-American paranormal researcher and author, teamed up with Vanessa Mitchell to write a book about the cage, titled Spirits of the Cage, True Accounts of Living in a Haunted Medieval Prison. The book chronicles not only Vanessa's personal experiences, but also Estep's own week-long investigation inside the house. Estep and a small team spent several nights sleeping at the cage, conducting vigils in the dark and using various ghost-hunting gadgets to capture evidence. Over the course of that week, they witnessed many of the phenomena already described, the noises, the doors, and some frightening personal encounters. Estep's narrative is written in a chronological and journalistic style, interwoven with Vanessa's personal recollections of past events. And while Estep's writing is engaging and often lightened with some British wit, the text was criticised by at least one reviewer for just lacking any historical rigour, the author being an investigator, not a historian. Minor factual errors, like the exact details of St Osyth's legend or the fate of Ursula's remain, were slipped in, which the reviewer felt weakened the book's credibility on the history front. However, the value of Spirits in the Cage lies in its rare depth of investigation. Very few investigations are actually published in full like this. Estep even included interviews with other teams and individuals who had felt compelled to probe the cage, adding their voices to the narrative. The cumulative effect, therefore, is a very multifaceted case study of a haunting. The British press, especially the tabloids, were delighted with the cage's story. It had everything, didn't it? A former witch's prison, a terrified single mum, ghost attacks, haunted houses that nobody could sell. The Sun ran an article in October 2018 in conjunction with a television special emblazoned with the sensational headline, "My horror of living in former witch's prison where my baby son was snatched from his cot, violent ghosts pushed friends down the stairs, and mysterious pools of blood appeared." And while tabloids are known to exaggerate, in this case that summary of events was largely in line with Vanessa's claims. Channel 4's true horror docudrama series produced a Halloween 2018 episode titled The Witch's Prison, which dramatised Vanessa's experiences at the cage. Actress Michelle Ryan portrayed Vanessa, reenacting scenes like the ghostly attacks and the baby in the cot scare. The production crew actually filmed portions of the show inside the real cage for authenticity, and even they remarked on the very odd atmosphere they felt while shooting. "We were quite glad when it was all over," admitted director Amanda Boyle. The Channel 4 docudrama blended interviews with Vanessa and dramatised sequences, ultimately giving the story a polished, but still terrifying, national spotlight. The haunting of the cage cannot be fully appreciated without pondering its symbolic resonance in our English folklore. It sits right at the intersection of two potent cultural archetypes, the wronged witch and the cursed building. In folklore, locations associated with traumatic injustice or suffering are often said to retain an imprint of those dark events, especially when the victims were innocents or persecuted souls. And the story of Ursula Kemp, and the other St Osyth witches is a tale of injustice. Poor women executed on flimsy evidence and fear. It's exactly the kind of tragic history that, in the popular imagination, begets ghosts. England's got many legends of witches and curses and hauntings. In some villages they still tell of how a witch, as she swung from the gallows, cast a curse on those who wronged her, and now her spirit haunts the town thereafter. In others, the mere fact that an accused witch died tragically, whether by execution or by mob violence, is enough to spawn tales of her restless apparition wandering the scene. The Cage's narrative plays right into this perfectly. We've got a small medieval lockup, purported to have held witches. There's the additional detail that children were taken away from these women before they were interrogated and eventually executed, implicitly paralleling Vanessa's own baby-snatching ghost ordeal, actually. Local law in Essex also suggests a lingering curse of Ursula Kemp on St Osyth, but the difficulty is that folklore and fact have intertwined to a confusing degree in this case. It became a celebrated haunted witch prison because people believed witches were held there. Ghost enthusiasts and mediums walking in expect to sense Ursula or other 16th century souls, and often that's exactly what they report. One medium-led team claimed to make contact with Elizabeth, presumably Elizabeth Bennet, the other executed witch who supposedly told them of her suffering. Another psychic felt pain in her leg and interpreted it as the spirit of a child who died there. The trouble is, if historians are correct, those witches might never have been in that building at all. The cage wasn't actually the site of Ursula's imprisonment, as new research suggests, and the entire premise of a witch's curse at the cage is thrown into question. But obviously something is happening there. Furthermore, the psychological phenomenon of place memory, or stone tape theory, as it's known, often aligns with cultural memory, if you know what I mean. So St Osyth's got a macabre resume of legends beyond the witches. It's got saints and monsters and monks, and they all occupy the tapestry of its supernatural folklore. The Essex countryside itself, the foggy marshes and ancient oak trees often lend hauntings a backdrop in English imagination. And when Vanessa felt an evil, malevolent presence in the cage and assumed it might be demonic, you might say she was tapping into a long-standing tradition of seeing Essex as a haunted landscape anyway. Her experience has then become, in a sense, new folklore, the 21st century chapter of St Osyth's ghost story canon. In broader folkloric terms, the cage also represents an enduring fascination with the witch trials in popular consciousness. From Salem, Massachusetts to Pendle Hill in Lancashire, sites associated with witch persecutions have become magnets for ghost lore. It's as if collective guilt or even sympathy for the victims transform into spectral tales, a way of acknowledging the wrongs and keeping the memory of the innocents alive. Ghost stories can serve as a cultural coping mechanism for historical atrocities. It wraps them in a narrative where victims at least have some agency, even if it's a frightening agency from beyond the grave. All that said, you've got to also consider the possibility that none of the ghosts in the cage have got anything to do with witches. Some mediums and ghost hunters said that the more aggressive entity in the cage felt more demonic or non-human, perhaps drawn by the dark history, but not actually a human spirit at all, hence the inconsistent identities. Many skeptics would point first to the mindset and conditions of the primary witness. Vanessa Mitchell, by her own account, when the most intense activity occurred, was under extreme stress. She was pregnant and then later a sleep-deprived new mother living alone in a place she already felt was not right from day one. It's not surprising that under those conditions you might experience hallucinations or an exacerbated fear response. Seeing a black smoky figure during the day, well, could that have been a momentary hallucination or a trick of the light, or a plume of actual dust caught in the sunlight, interpreted by an anxious mind as a figure? The human brain, when stressed and primed by fear, is known to misinterpret stimuli. Shadows become menacing figures. We all remember being kids and trying to fall asleep in the dark room, and the dressing gown hanging on the door takes on the form of a monster. Vanessa frequently describes the feeling of evil in the house and the sense of being watched. Now, those are real feelings. but feelings can be influenced by suggestion. We should also note that Vanessa was aware of the house's history from the beginning. The plaque announced it, and she'd heard village stories. Even if subconsciously she had seeded in her mind the expectation of creepiness, then it may have manifested. It's called confirmation bias, isn't it? Or expectancy effect sometimes. You experience what you expect to experience. And once a few odd things happen, it can snowball into an event. The doors opening could be due to drafts. It's a centuries-old cottage with old timber frames and floorboards expanding and contracting, making loud bangs and creaks that can sound eerily like footsteps. What about Mikey being dragged down the stairs then? Or the baby basket being moved outside? Well, as a skeptic, you might just question the veracity of those two stories. Could Mikey simply have slipped and in the chaos of falling misremembered it as being pulled? And as for the baby incidents, skeptics would note that only Vanessa witnessed the basket outside. Is it possible that she herself moved the baby and then under stress had a bit of a memory lapse? Or could another person have been there playing tricks? Perhaps not likely, but there were rumours among some locals that a friend of Vanessa's might have helped stage some events to convince her to leave out of concern for her baby. There's no evidence for this beyond a bit of gossip, but it illustrates the point. Without hard evidence, you've got to allow for doubt. A glaring development that skeptics seized upon came in 2021-ish, when new historical research suggested the cage might not have been a witch prison at all. Paranormal investigators Laura and Mac from Paranormal Reason undertook an extensive archival study of St Osyth's records, old maps and the architectural fabric of the cage, and their findings, published in 2023, were startling. They argue that the building known as the cage is not as ancient as believed, and likely was not the actual 16th century lockup used in Ursula Kemp's time. Key evidence included the house's layout and materials, suggesting it was built in the early 1800s, much later than the 1500s. It underwent heavy renovation in the 1970s, including adding the upper floor. The cage is not listed as a historic structure, implying that it had no historical significance worth protecting, odd if it truly were a medieval prison. They even found that historic England had no record of a lockup on that exact site. By consulting estate maps, they pinpointed another spot on the street where the real medieval cage likely stood, which was demolished and paved over during roadworks in the 1930s. The plaque on the current cottage, they suspect, was added later as a kind of homage or due to a mistaken local tradition. If Laura and Mac are correct, the entire legend of the cage housing Ursula Kemp is then a folkloric falsehood. The saga of the cage is a rich tapestry woven from history and folklore and personal trauma and investigative curiosity. And if you lean towards believing ghostly claims, or if you favour the sceptical explanations, one thing is definitely certain. This place has made its mark. This once humble cottage has transformed into a modern legend, the kind of story that will be told around campfires and on paranormal YouTube channels for years to come. It encapsulates the timeless allure of a great ghost story, a setting with a dark history, a protagonist who undergoes a profound ordeal, a series of unexplained events that invite debate, and a thematic resonance that touches on deeper nerves, the injustice of the witch trials and the notion of vengeful spirits. By the late 2010s, Vanessa Mitchell had finally managed to sell the cage after many attempts. An Australian couple purchased the property, undeterred by its reputation, or perhaps motivated by it, since they teased turning it into a haunted holiday stay. However, according to local reports, the new owners eventually decided to distance themselves from the paranormal circus. They halted all ghost tours and investigations, and the cage went silent to outsiders. Perhaps they chose to renovate and live quietly, or simply didn't wish to stir whatever energies might linger. The cage stands quiet again, its windows shuttered to prying eyes, but its story continues to ripple through the paranormal community. In 2023, when the research came out challenging the authenticity of the site, it sparked fresh discussions. Could a place be haunted by a history that didn't occur there? Laura of Paranormal Reason mused, "The cage is many things to many people, but evidently it was becoming clear what it was not, a historic property." But even she didn't dismiss the haunting outright. Instead, she emphasised how easily folklore and fact become tangled, creating a legend that then takes on a life of its own. In the end, standing before the cage on a misty evening, you might feel a chill. Independent of any ghost, you realise you're face to face with history and myth, intertwined, the very essence of a haunted place. And as you peer at the old plaque by lantern light, you might even hear the faint echo of a woman's voice, carried on the breeze, chanting softly a lullaby for the child she lost, or a curse on the unjust. And then the rational mind reasserts itself. It's just the wind, isn't it? With a shiver and a half smile, you turn away from the cage, leaving its door firmly closed. The mystery remains safely locked within, as it has since 1582, and as it may well remain unsolved for centuries to come.